Hi everyone. Good evening. Thank you for returning to BLEMF one more night. There's 2 more nights to go after this. I am very, very pleased to introduce for the pre-concert discussion two scholars who are brilliant, have been working on really, really important musicological work and produced this incredible edition that you will hear Tonos del Sur play tonight. Cesar Favila, musicologist at UCLA. And Paul Feller, doctoral candidate at Northwestern University, but a Bloomington resident currently. Yay! And then we'll be talking to our absolute beloved Sarah Cranner. Sarah has been instrumental, has been deeply embedded in the early music scene in BLEMF, in so much that we do, and I'm so grateful for everything that you do, Sarah. So I'm looking forward to what you're talking about. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Suzanne, and thank you, Javier, for making this possible. I am so excited about tonight's performance. The music that you'll be listening to, as you probably saw in the program, is music from these 17th century manuscripts from the Convent of the Santísima Trinidad, the Holy Trinity Convent, a 17th century convent in Puebla, New Spain, as colonial Mexico was called. And I encountered these manuscripts a long time ago in graduate school as I was trying to form a dissertation project about colonial music in New Spain. That is to say, the music of where my grandparents came from. They came to the United States in the 50s, and there was so much literature that I read in graduate school on the music of Italian convents, and I thought, well, why aren't there a lot of books on the music of nuns in New Spain? And I discovered that there aren't a lot of books on this topic because there aren't very many sources in terms of music manuscripts that are left from these convents. So many of them were shut down in the 19th century, and a lot of their historical documents, their musical documents, were destroyed. So I actually came across another collection of convent music at the Newberry Library in Chicago. Imagine, that's where some manuscripts ended up. And then the collection that we're working on and that you'll hear from tonight is from an archive called the Carlos Chavez National Music Research Institute in Mexico City, which is not the same city as Puebla. So you see how difficult it can be to start doing research when the manuscripts end up being scattered all over the place. And so Paul and I have been, Paul's been a wonderful colleague and interlocutor. We've been sort of studying these manuscripts to try to make a modern performing edition of some of them so that we can listen to this music again. And so I'm going to begin tonight's discussion with a few questions for Paul about that sort of manuscript to modern performing edition process, and then we will move the conversation on to the actual preparation of the performance. So let's see, I have a few questions here, and all right. So Paul, having been trained in musicology in Chile, has had greater experience with a wider variety of colonial Latin American sources. So my first question, Paul, is what was your first impression of these sources? So we primarily worked with them in digitized format, I should mention, but how do they compare to other manuscripts you've encountered, say from the Santiago de Chile Cathedral, whose music manuscripts I know you've worked with more?
Well, I will say that even beyond Santiago, but especially Santiago, the first thing that I noticed with the new Spanish manuscripts is how well made they are, how careful was the notation, and how well preserved they were. And that is also true for the, I've worked in archives in the Netherlands and Germany. I would say that it's also valid for those cases. Clearly, most of these manuscripts, the new Spanish manuscripts, were extremely well preserved. Some of them have a little bit of damage, but for the most part, it's pretty easy to understand how they are, especially when you compare it with other cases. For example, the library manuscripts that we have here, the Guatemalan manuscripts, which are falling apart. So in that sense, the challenge has not come from the manuscripts themselves, even though some are missing parts. That is true, and we have worked with the complete sets, but also the notation is incredibly homogeneous, so to say. It spans 17th and 18th century kind of notations, and the handwriting is just pristine. It is, for the most part, it's extremely beautiful. And for those of you who have worked with the early manuscript, you can only imagine how grateful I was to encounter such a nice manufacturing product.
Yeah, and I should add, I'll say that nowadays, depending on what kind of PhD program in musicology one goes to, one may very well no longer be trained as rigorously in notation the way Paul was trained in Chile during his undergraduate studies. What I'm able to do with these manuscripts, based on my own sort of self-training, would take me, a day compared to the couple of hours that it takes him to very quickly get on Sibelius and notate these things. That's why I've been extraordinarily grateful to be able to work with them and to have them double check and triple check and quadruple check my own transcriptions and just sort of go back and forth like that. So I'm very grateful. So tell us a little bit, we'll talk a little bit more about music notation in manuscripts. So what is it like for those of us who might not have a musicological background? What is this old music notation like? In other words, why do we have to take these manuscripts and spend the time inputting their information into computer and transcribing them these days?
Thank you so much. Notation nowadays is a product. I mean, modern notation, contemporary notation, has been a product of an increased drive to control more and more specific aspects of the performance. When we go back to the 17th and early 18th centuries, there was much more that was implicit, that was left to the performer. So the reality is that knowing the notation, or sometimes we call that music paleography, is only one part there of the transcription process. There's also a set of practices that are not necessarily being taught anymore regarding, for example, kind of the ancestry of solfege or reading music that in a way that is adaptable. Also practices of transposition, or meaning that even if you see a pitch, a particular pitch, it doesn't mean that it is that pitch. But the notation itself, it is very specific to the Hispanic case. What we work with here is usually called white menstrual notation. That means that it is wider than the blacker notation that we have today. That is obvious, but it also means that the precise rhythmic meaning of the figures, of the signs that we see, is highly dependent on its context. We are not given many of the features such as tempo or how fast or slow we're supposed to perform. We are not giving bars, and in many cases, we are not even given accidentals that we're supposed to supplement in certain specific cases based on earlier practices of music theory. These are all practices that the nuns, the performers, would have known and would have been taught. So engaging with these sources is really a way of engaging with several stages of the performance practice. The other thing is that it really doesn't end there, because there's also layers of the language. For the villancicos, we're talking music in the vernacular, and in that case, it is Spanish. But again, this is not your 21st century, 20th century Spanish. This is older Spanish, and some of these are extremely convoluted poems that we need to decipher as well, and the handwriting is also different. So the complications arise at every step.
Yes, I can assure you that my heritage Spanish did not help me with all of this. And in fact, I was pointing out earlier that the most famous 17th century nun poet of New Spain, of Mexico, is right here, right behind me. On the side, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, as she's depicted in the old 200 peso bill from Mexico. So you want to talk about some really difficult, very allegorical poetry and writing, check out some of her villancicos. So, yeah, thanks for bringing up the issue of language. We both struggled with some of these translations, haven't we? So now I have a question that attends to some very, very recent concerns that have been in the media, the issue of AI. And I'm not talking about Indiana University's assistant instructors. I'm talking about artificial intelligence and how it has affected various creative realms. Do you think that this transcription process of taking old manuscripts and making them accessible for contemporary performance, do you think that this process might be successfully achieved by artificial intelligence?
Well, so thank you so much. This is an issue that I've been thinking about for a long time. Let me start by saying that I wish it was. It would make everything easier, faster, and then we would just have to double check everything. I've been lucky enough to be able to talk to some of the people who are actually working on this. And the reality, people, especially at MIT, Michael Scott Cuthbert has developing Music 21, software for the visual recognition of music and for analysis. The reality is that we are decades away from being able to just feed AI any visual score, especially an early visual score, and for that the AI to be able to accurately transcribe it. And it has to do with the way that the AI works. There is simply not enough human power, I know that sounds paradoxical, to feed the AI the amount of data that it will require, and visual recognition is, there's no good way to put it, it's just a disaster, it's a mess. It's simply not powerful enough at this point. Even for us sometimes, we're working with digital tools that are extremely helpful, but sometimes you really cannot tell if you're dealing with a dot, a rhythmic dot, or if it's a fly that died there 100 years ago. And if we, people who have been lucky to receive an extremely precise and lengthy training, special training, if we struggle with that, a machine struggles 100 times more. Simply, a machine is just it is a machine. You feed the machine an algorithm, you feed it data, and it's able to basically, in a binary position and a binary code, say this fits, it doesn't fit, ones and zeros. We are simply not there yet. My hope is that with tremendous effort of feeding information from some enterprises such as the Repertoire International, the International Repertory of Musical Sources, we're going to be able to amass the amount of data required for that. and machine learning. I think is going to be the future, but unfortunately, I know this, fortunately for me right now, because that means that I don't run out of work. I'm employed for a little bit longer, but unfortunately for what the interesting work that needs to happen after producing the editions, it's still going to be a couple decades.
Well, such are the challenges of archival work. I will say that one of the benefits of having spent a lot of time doing this kind of, archive rat work is that I never would have thought it would have prepared me for COVID times. I had to use gloves and masks for hours and hours and days at a time that I spent in the archives to handle some of this material. Your comment about the dead fly reminded me of this. To some extent, yes, to preserve the materials, but also to keep one from, potentially breathing in harmful spores from fungus that grow on the papers and things like that. So, yeah, you reminded me of that.
Yeah.
So let's switch the conversation now as we're inching closer and closer to this long awaited concert to talk about the performance preparation. And I'd like to start, Sarah, first of all, by asking you to discuss a little bit about this wonderful ensemble, Tonos del Sur, that you established. Tell us a little bit about the history of the ensemble.
Sure. Well, we actually started out as a course at IU, thanks to Javier Leon and the Latin American Music Center. We were open campus-wide. The only stipulation is that you must be willing to explore a historical instrument or perform in a historically informed style. So I very vividly remember one of our earliest rehearsals. I had a bassoon player who had never played a Baroque bassoon before, and they were just struggling with a particular note, and they asked me, like, hey, can we tune that note? I was like, well, I don't know how to play it yet. So we had everything from that to doctoral students in historical performance. Really a broad range of interests and passions, which was great. It sort of winnowed down and then took on life of its own. Some of the most passionate, I guess, of us, especially those who do historical performance professionally, banded together and have continued, and we are now officially, finally, a 501c3. I did my doctoral research quite a bit on Santiago Billoni, who's a composer in Durango, Mexico, around the 1720s, and we started exploring his music. That's a very passion of ours, and then we've also made it a priority to perform and study in depth music that's anonymous, which is often overlooked because it's hard to wade through books and books of anonymous music, but we miss a lot of wonderful things that way. And then also music by indigenous composers and in indigenous languages, which as a violinist has been a particularly great challenge for me. I speak English and I am passable in Spanish, and the rest has been a grand adventure. So that's become a priority, and Tonos has performed several concerts around, especially the Indiana area, and we're excited to see where we go from here.
Wonderful. Anonymous is my favorite composer because it actually gets one thinking outside of that composer-centric model that so much of our concert repertory has emphasized over the years, and that's one thing that Paul and my critical edition is trying to sort of move away from. It's what did we call it? The Virgin Mary's essence in New Spanish song. And of course, some of the villancicos do indeed have composers attributed to them, both New Spanish as well as Spanish composers, as well as a lot of anonymous ones. And some of the manuscripts actually have some of the musicians' names, some of the sisters' names. And so I'd rather just highlight those women's names from the past to sort of give them some kind of credit that they've never received for having been very, very hard-working musicians. I'm also reminded, Sarah, since you mentioned the Baroque bassoon, are you guys performing with a Baroque bassoon tonight?
We're not.
Okay,
tonight,
that's
actually.
okay, but believe it or not,
better.
the nuns were actually very, very well versed in Baroque bassoon in this convent. They called it a bajon, B-A-J-O-N, and because at times they didn't have, all the voice registers to sing the different parts. Sometimes they just use a bassoon to play like some of the tenor parts, some of the tenor lines. Okay, so you mentioned that you are a Billoni scholar, so you're familiar with colonial Latin American music from wider places in New Spain and South America. So what was your first impression of this convent music that we just handed you and you graciously offered to perform for us? Does it look the same? Does it sound the same in terms of some of the music you've performed before?
I guess the closest comparison I could make is some of the earlier repertoire that we've tackled in the ensemble, but still, I would say a particular kind of interesting challenge with this program is almost everything is in 3 and almost everything is in minor. And so how to make all the different contrasts in texts and textures come across in music that's constructed, maybe just upon first glance, very, very similarly. So I think that was the thing that struck me the most every time I went to the next piece. Again, it's in 3, again, it's in minor, which is just kind of fascinating. I thought that was the thing that struck me the most.
Well, it's all in minor because it's all sad, isn't it? No.
Not at all.
Absolutely not, yeah. So in the program, you'll notice that there are some pieces that will be improvised. So, Sarah, tell us a little bit about these improvised pieces that we're going to hear tonight.
Sure, I'll touch on 2 things first,
Sure.
actually. We don't have bassoon to play some of the missing parts, but we will do them on violin. In particular, there's one double choir piece, and given the mix of instruments and singers possible for this weekend, this festival, the treble 2 voice in each choir is a violin. So we're kind of a nod to the original, I guess. With that in mind, and with everything being very text heavy, of course, we wanted a little bit of a sonic break. And then also I have absolutely no doubt that everyone performing these originally would be able to make something beautiful on the spot. We've kind of approached it 2 ways. It's been a good personal challenge for me. I've never freely improvised in front of anyone, so wish me luck. I sort of started with a structure, and I know kind of some points along the way. I challenged Anastasia to do the same in however she felt comfortable, and I actually handed her an organ book of some pieces that we have found from across the Americas, and she took snippets from each and crafted a whole narrative through that. So it was a way for kind of a sonic break, and also Anastasia's improvisation will move us from the, if I remember correctly, I kept flipping the order in my mind, from the Marian to the Eucharistic. No, vice versa. Can't remember what we settled on without looking at the program, but basically to separate the 2 halves for us. So several purposes with that in mind.
Wonderful. Well, this looks like a very, very rigorous audience, so you should be nervous about your
Yes.
I don't think so. You've all been extremely generous and attentive, and maybe with the few minutes we have left, we might open the floor up for a few questions that you might have ahead of the program, in case some of the notes were not clear, or in case you're curious about anything we've said so far.
Were the nuns performing in the context of worship or separate concerts? Who was their audience?
Sure. So the context specifically for villancicos is what we would call a para-liturgical context, i.e. outside the liturgy of the Mass, outside the liturgy of the Divine Office, these daily prayers that the nuns had to sing and recite. However, by outside, we don't mean that the music was not performed during the rituals. We mean that the music is not in Latin. It's in Spanish. It's in the vernacular. And so the music was performed within, if you were there listening to them, you would be within a type of liturgical ritual. But, explicitly we would call it paraliturgical. The music was also performed outside during processions, when there were processions. However, they were cloistered nuns, so the cloistered nuns didn't get to sing their villancicos outside on the streets accompanying the Blessed Sacrament on the Feast of Corpus Christi. They got to have their own processions inside their beautiful cloisters. So if you can imagine those, for those of you who've been to Europe or Mexico and you see those really, really old buildings with the big giant courtyards and the arches all around, this is where they might have sung some of this music. Yes?
So a lot of this music has been available in transcription and blocks of performance for quite a while. Is what the three of you are doing making you rethink the way that her music is presented?
Well, this is a question that comes up quite frequently because Sor Juana is so famous. First of all, let me just say that I would define her works as poetry that was then taken by composers and set to music. And there's been a lot of sort of discussion and debate about whether she was a composer or not. I don't think she was. It's been very, very difficult to really find and pinpoint a woman composer from New Spain or from Latin America, the way there used to be quite a bit of women composers in 17th century Italy, and specifically as well in 17th century Italian convents. Not so much in Spain, certainly not so much in Latin America. We know that she was extraordinarily erudite, and she was fascinated by music, and she supposedly wrote a music treatise that went lost. But I think that her music, the music that was, the music that was used to accompany her poetry, if you will, I think it can just as well have issues of performance practice, like what Paul was talking about, and that ensembles should take that music and be creative with it, just as we're being tonight. Yeah, you're welcome.
Well, I'll just speak up for a moment about some of the things we've done in rehearsal preparation. I got the music, of course, thank you, and that's where my process began, and deciding, okay, where do we start? How many verses? Who sings them? How many times do we do the chorus? Do we insert instrumental introductions? Do we add violins? Do we not? What's the continuo group? That for me has been the fascination and the joy of this type of preparation. I was joking that for once it would feel very strange to just start at the beginning and go to the end and play what's on the paper. That's absolutely not what's going to happen in terms of especially roadmap and adding and subtracting textures. So that's kind of a fascinating aspect, at least from my side of things.
Great. We have time for maybe one more quick question before we stretch and get ready to transition over to the performance room. Anybody? Yes?
I'm terribly sorry to interrupt. We are going to have to save our concert, our questions for the future. It is time to start heading over to the theater for our concert today.
Okay.
Please, we will have scholars available for questions after.
Thank you all so much for your attention.
Thank you.